Lena Harris thought grief had no more surprises until her 63rd birthday, when a card slid under her door read, "Happy birthday, Lena. I was never far flawed. Look under the floorboards." 17 years after her husband vanished, the silence began to crack. What she found buried beneath her home would unravel the story she'd told herself and reveal a truth more haunting than absence. Lena Harris had always believed in quiet lives. Hers was the kind that unfolded in muted tones, with soft coffee steam rising in the kitchen at 7:10 every morning, the newspaper folded neatly by the sink, and a porch swing that creaked with familiarity. Maplewood, Oregon didn't ask for much, just that you showed up on time and waved at your neighbors, and for most of her adult life, Lena had done just that. Her husband, Grant, a literature professor with a fondness for worn hardbacks and Dylan Thomas quotes, had been her partner for 21 years. Together they had raised a son, Jake, now 19 and halfway through his sophomore year at the University of Montana. Their house on Hazel Lane was modest, a two-storm slate blue with ivy curling around the porch beams, but it was home. October brought the scent of wet leaves and cinnamon sugar donuts from the corner bakery. It also brought change. Lena didn't know that yet. On the morning of October 14, 2003, Grant poured himself a second cup of coffee, absent-mindedly scribbled in the margins of a student paper, then looked up and said, "I'm heading to Salem today. Todd Collins from the old department wants to talk publishing ideas." Lena, folding laundry, nodded. "Take the Camry. The truck's still acting up." He leaned in, kissed her cheek. "Don't wait up." It was their last ordinary moment. By 8 p.m., Lena was passing. The roast she'd planned had gone cold. His phone went straight to voicemail. By midnight, she called Jake, hoping he might have heard from his dad. He hadn't. By 2 a.m., she called the police. The next day, the silver Toyota Camry was found parked near an abandoned ferry terminal along the Santiam River. The driver's door was locked. Inside the vehicle, Grant's phone, wallet, university ID, and a folded flannel jacket. No signs of struggle. No note. No body. The search lasted 10 days. Helicopters combed wooded trails and highway ditches. Lena didn't sleep. Jake came home from school and stayed by her side, his face prematurely hardened by the unknown. Theories started to surface like oil on water. Depression, burnout, midlife unraveling. Grant had recently been denied tenure. Maybe he hadn't shared the full weight of it. A river suicide, the sheriff had said quietly in the living room, was more common than people liked to believe. Strong current this time of year. Sometimes the bodies just don't turn up. Lena's hands clenched around a cold mug. "Grant didn't even like water," she whispered. "He always got motion sick on the ferry to Portland." But facts became ghosts, and eventually ghosts became accepted. By December, Lena was planning a memorial, not because she believed he was truly gone, but because everyone else needed her to. Friends showed up in black coats. Jake spoke, quietly choking on the word Dad. A photo of Grant, him smiling beside Jake at Crater Lake, was placed on a stand where a coffin would have been. After the service, Lena sat alone in the living room. The casserole dishes had been cleared, the guests had left, and Jake was asleep upstairs. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of chimes. She stared at the spot on the couch where Grant always sat with his grading papers, his left ankle hooked over his right knee. She imagined him there. Then didn't. Then did again. Months passed. Jake returned to school. Lena kept busy. She reopened the used bookstore on Main Street she had inherited from her aunt, a dusty, quiet place named Dog-Eared and Forgotten Stories. Some days she barely spoke a word until dinner. The town gave her space. People were kind, but not invasive, and she didn't know whether to thank them or resent them for it. Grant's clothes stayed in the closet for 5 months, then 6. Then one day she boxed them up. Not all, just most. His copy of Leaves of Grass remained on the nightstand. His mug, chipped on the rim, stayed on the shelf. It was grief, but shaped into routine. She started writing in the margins of her own books again, something Grant always encouraged. She began seeing herself as an individual, not just half of a unit. But even with the quiet peace that occasionally found her, the questions never truly died. Because sometimes, in the lull between dinner and bed, when the house was too quiet and the wind pressed against the windows just right, Lena swore she could feel Grant's absence thicken the air. By the summer of 2004, Lena Harris had stopped expecting phone calls in the middle of the night, the kind that might begin with a breath, a pause, and then the words, "We found him." After 10 months of silence from Grant's disappearances, she stood in front of a small group of mourners inside the Maplewood Community Church and said a few careful words. She didn't say, "Goodbye." She didn't say past. Instead, she said, "We honor what was, and let that be enough." Most people accepted the silence as truth. They remembered how quiet Grant had become after being denied tenure, how he'd stopped bringing home new books, how he'd canceled class more often, spent long hours in the backyard alone, sometimes scribbling nothing in his notebook. Rumors had whispered about exhaustion, depression, and academic burnout. Lena never denied them, not because she fully believed them, but because arguing against a ghost made her sound unstable. What no one knew was that Grant hadn't seemed broken to her. Quiet, yes, but not distant, not truly. For the next year, Lena lived in fragments. She woke early and wandered through the house like a caretaker in a museum of her own life. She folded laundry she never wore, watered the plants Grant had once named ironically after Shakespeare characters, Juliet the jade plant, Hamlet the cactus. Her friends checked in less as time passed. Jake visited on holidays and occasional weekends, but the gaps in conversation widened. He seemed to be grieving in reverse, more withdrawn now than when Grant first disappeared. Lena left his bedroom untouched, the faded soccer posters and old geometry textbooks still on the shelves. In spring 2005, Lena began going to the library again, not just to borrow books, but to sit in the quiet and write in the margins of used novels. She would choose copies with curled corners and scribbled underlines, curious about what thoughts others had once left behind. It made her feel less alone. One rainy Wednesday, the librarian, a warm, bespectacled woman named Ruth, slipped her a small flyer with watercolor flowers along the edges. "Looking for part-time help at Dog-Eared & Co. Inquire within." Lena stared at it for a long time before folding it into her purse. By fall, she was working there 3 afternoons a week. The store had been closed for almost a year since its original owner passed away. Lena offered to help reopen it. She cleaned the windows, cataloged every spine, scrubbed the faint scent of mildew out of the backroom rugs, and, almost without realizing it, brought the place back to life. When the store reopened in March 2006, under her name, Dog-Eared & Co., became more than a business. It was an extension. Locals came for the paperbacks but stayed for her recommendations, her gentle smile, and the free coffee she brewed each morning. The shelves were organized not alphabetically but emotionally. Books for rainy days, stories that whisper instead of shout. Some mornings she would open the store early just to sit by the window with a cup of coffee and the light filtering in, watching dust dance through the sunbeams like quiet ghosts. She was still grieving, but differently now. It had texture, rhythm, less like drowning, more like carrying a heavy coat. People noticed the change. She smiled more, laughed, though rarely. A few of the town's single men, divorced dentists, a retired postal worker, even the pastor's brother, found reasons to stop by. They'd ask about a book and linger too long in the checkout line. One even left flowers once, a small bouquet of sunflowers wrapped in brown paper. Lena placed them in a jar behind the counter, said thank you, but didn't call the number tucked inside the ribbon. When asked why she never dated, Lena would simply say, "It's too soon." After a year, she said, "I'm not ready." After 2 years, she said, "I'm comfortable." But the truth was heavier than those answers. It wasn't about moving on or staying loyal. It was about silence. Grant's vanishing had left behind too many questions. Dating meant explaining, and how do you explain that sometimes you still imagined him walking through the door with an apology on his lip, or that sometimes you dreamt he was in trouble, trapped, trying to get back? Or worse, that he was simply living another life somewhere, choosing not to return. In 2007, Lena painted the inside of the store a soft gray mew and added a corner chair for local readers. She started a Wednesday reading circle for retirees and moms with toddlers. Jake graduated college and moved to Seattle. He called on Sundays, sometimes Tuesdays. He never talked much about his father. Lena didn't push. One night in late September, she stayed late at the shop, organizing a shipment of donated books. The street outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled into your skin. As she was closing the back room, she noticed a draft. A loose panel near the floor was slightly ajar. She bent down, closed it, and locked the door behind her. That night, she lay awake longer than usual. Something had shifted, not dramatically, just a whisper of something unsettled. She chalked it up to fatigue, a long day autumn coming, but even as she told herself that, her hand drifted to the nightstand, to the worn hardcover of Middlemarch that Grant had gifted her years ago. She opened to the front page. His handwriting was there, "To Lena, the only ending I'll ever need." She closed the book slowly, rolled onto her side, stared at the sliver of moonlight through the curtains. Some nights, grief was a scream. Other nights, it was a lullaby. But on this particular night, it felt like something else entirely, like a knock that hadn't yet sounded, like a door waiting to open. And in the weeks to follow, though she didn't yet know it, the past she had tried so carefully to bury was already on its way back. The morning of Lena Harris's 63rd birthday arrived with little fanfare. It was a Monday in late October, gray skies pressing low over Maplewood, and the first breath of frost clung to the edges of her garden window. She woke early, made coffee, and stood at the sink watching the squirrels raid the bird feeder like tiny bandits. The phone buzzed around 8, Jake's voice cheerful but sleepy. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said. "Didn't forget this time, I swear." She laughed, told him not to worry, and listened to him ramble about his job in Seattle and the rain that hadn't stopped all week. When they hung up, the silence that followed didn't feel empty, just expected. She wasn't planning to celebrate. Maybe a slice of carrot cake from Miller's Bakery later, if she remembered. Maybe a slice of wine with a book. Her life, by now, was measured in small, soft rituals. At 10:23 a.m., as she was sweeping the porch steps, she noticed a small envelope tucked neatly between the edge of the doorframe and the welcome mat. No postage, no address, just her name, Lena, written in a hand she hadn't seen in over 20 years. Her breath caught. The envelope was cream-colored, textured, and faintly bent at the corner as if someone had held it for a long time before deciding to deliver it. She knelt, picked it up, and stood staring at the handwriting. Her thumb traced the capital L, the way it looped just slightly too tall, the cross of the E that slanted downward instead of flat, and finally the G. Though it wasn't visible here, she knew what it would look like inside. Grant had always written his G's like a curled hook, a half-moon hanging from a string. It had been a silly habit, one he never changed, not even when signing tax forms or grading papers. Lena stared at the envelope for nearly a minute before going back inside. She didn't open it right away. Instead, set it on the counter, made another cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and let the moment stretch. There were many logical explanations. A prank, someone from the college remembering old letters. A coincidence in handhuntry, though her gut recoiled at the idea. She had known Grant since she was 22. She had memorized the slope of his handwriting the way one might memorize a face. When she finally opened the envelope, her hands trembled more than she expected. Inside was a birthday card, simple, unremarkable, watercolor flowers on the front, the kind you could find at any drugstore, but inside, scrawled in blue ink, were the words that stopped her breath. "Happy birthday, Lena. I was never far. Look under the floorboards. No signature, nothing else." The G in far was unmistakable, curled like a secret. The writing wasn't a copy, not traced or printed. It was written by someone who knew exactly how Grant had looped his letters, someone who had the same hesitations between words, the same rhythm to their thoughts. She dropped the card on the table and stood abruptly, knocking over her coffee. The mug shattered on the tile floor, and she barely noticed. Her heart was pounding against her ribs like fists on a locked door. She sat back down, staring at the card, trying to breathe. There was no way. It had been 20 years. Grant was gone. Or was he? Theories spiraled. Maybe he hadn't drowned. Maybe he had staged the whole thing. Maybe he'd been watching her all these years. But why now? Why a birthday card? Why the floorboards? She read the message again, then a third time. The phrasing wasn't just familiar, it was deliberate. "I was never far," that wasn't how people talked. It was how Grant wrote. He had always spoken with distance in his prose, a kind of poetic detachment he reserved for journal entries and anniversary letters. It wasn't just what the message said, it was who it sounded like. Lena stood, walked to the sink, and washed her hands slowly. The water was too hot. She let it scald just a little, to anchor herself in the now. She considered throwing the card away, pretending she'd never seen it. But that wasn't her. That had never been her. Her fingers curled tightly around the edges of the card as she stepped into the living room. The floors had been refinished 5 years ago, but the originals were still beneath. She knew the weak spot by the hall closet, the one that always creaked when you stepped too hard. That's where she began. She fetched a flathead screwdriver from the kitchen drawer, knelt by the closet, and pried at the corner board. Dust puffed up like a sigh. It took only a minute to loosen the plank, and when she lifted it, her stomach turned. Beneath the wood was a hollow gap. Inside sat a small metal box, brushed steel, like something you'd find in an old filing cabinet. Her hand hovered over it for a long moment before she reached in and pulled it free. The box was cold, heavier than it looked. She placed it on the carpet and knelt beside it. There was no lock, just a latch. When she opened it, her breath hitched. Inside were photographs, dozens. Most were old, faded, but a few looked recent. In one, Grant stood in front of a house she didn't recognize, smiling beside a woman with shoulder-length auburn hair and a child who looked no older than 10. Lena's fingers trembled as she shuffled through them. In another, Grant wore glasses, held a newspaper dated 2020, and had a streak of gray in his beard. Another showed him pushing a girl on a swing. At the bottom of the box was a USB drive and a manila envelope. She pulled out the envelope first. Inside were documents, printouts of flight itineraries, bank statements under the name Marcus Lindley, a Montana driver's license with Grant's face but a different name. The USB lay like a buried truth. She stared at it, then slipped it into her pocket without opening it. She sat back against the wall, the box beside her, and stared at the plank of floor still lifted, like a wound in the house. Her mind buzzed with static. This wasn't closure. This was a new beginning, twisted and cruel. Grant hadn't died. He had disappeared on purpose, and somehow, impossibly, had returned, or at least reached out. The air around her felt tight. The world had been steady, if quiet. Now it tilted like a door just ajar, and through that opening, a flood of questions surged forward, silent but deafening, pulling her toward answers she wasn't sure she was ready to know. She stood slowly, gripping the card, the box still open at her feet. Lena didn't sleep that night. She left the box unopened in the living room, but even with her bedroom door closed, she could feel its presence pressing against the walls, like a held breath. The next morning she rose before the sun, brewed a pot of coffee that she didn't drink, and stood staring at the slanted light creeping across the hardwood. The card was still on the table, the envelope now torn at the edges where she'd gripped it too tightly. She picked it up once more, rereading the message for the 100th time, then glanced toward the hallway that led to the back of the house. The storage room, once Grant's makeshift workshop, had been barely touched in years. It was where he used to fix things, lamps, picture frames, radios that buzzed with static. Lena rarely went in anymore, except when she needed something obscure like sandpaper or a replacement light bulb. That morning, as though propelled by instinct rather than reason, she opened the door and flipped on the light. Dust coated every surface. The scent was metallic and sharp, a mix of rust, old wood, and time. A stack of crates sat in one corner, half covered by a faded drop-cloth. She stepped carefully over an old toolbox and made her way to the far wall. The floorboards here were different, older, less varnished, one of them slightly warped. She remembered Grant once saying something about replacing them, but he never had. Kneeling down, she pressed her fingers to the seam and felt it shift. With effort, she wedged the screwdriver under the edge and pried it loose. The board creaked, then lifted cleanly, revealing a narrow hollow beneath. Inside, wrapped in a layer of plastic and secured with duct tape, was a rusted gray metal box no larger than a shoebox. Her breath hitched. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it to the dining table and sat in silence for a long while before opening it. The latch was stiff but not locked. With a soft click, the lid came free. Photographs lay on top, faded slightly but unmistakably recent. The first showed Grant standing outside a modest house with green shutters, holding the leash of a black Labrador. His hair was grayer now, neatly trimmed, and he wore round glasses. He looked comfortable. Not haunted or hunted, just older. In another, he sat at a patio table with a woman who appeared to be in her mid-30s, her auburn hair swept back in a loose braid. She was laughing, leaning toward him, one hand resting casually on his arm. A third photo made Lena's chest tighten, a child on her swinging, his hands gently pushing her forward. The girl looked about 8 or 9, dark curls bouncing around her face, her grin wide and unbothered. Beneath the stack of photographs was a flash drive, secured inside a small envelope labeled simply, "For Records." Lena stared at it, debating. Her hands were shaking as she slid it into the USB port of her laptop. The folder opened with a single click. Inside were over 24 files, PDFs, scans, documents. The first was a Kansas State driver's license under the name Marcus Linley. The face was Grant. Same tired eyes, same slight dimple in his left cheek. The next document was a passport issued in 2014 under the same name. Then came tax returns filed for 5 consecutive years, all listing a residential address in Lawrence, Kansas. Lena opened each one, her eyes scanning line after line of fabricated history. There were hotel receipts from cities she'd never known he visited: Missoula, Albuquerque, Cedar Rapids. One file contained medical records for a child named Nora Linley, born July 2013, mother listed as Valerie Shaw. Lena scrolled slowly, absorbing the weight of each line. Bank statements revealed an account opened in Topeka under Grant's alias. Transfers showed regular payments to a woman named V. Shaw, monthly deposits aligned with school fees, utility payments, and something marked as child care reimbursement. She opened a final folder labeled PH_2022. Dozens more images. Grant blowing out candles at a birthday party with the little girl in his lap. The woman kissing his cheek. Him building a treehouse, holding a sparkler, carrying groceries. Life moments. Not stolen, but deliberately constructed. Lena felt the weight of betrayal pressed down on her chest like a closing door. She closed the laptop and sat back, the box still open, the evidence now no longer abstract. Grant hadn't just disappeared. He had erased himself from her life and re-reached himself from her life mathematic with a second family, with a daughter who probably thought he was her only parent worth trusting. He had chosen this, carefully, systematically, not in panic, but in purpose. And yet, he had sent the card. Why now? Why break the silence after 2 decades of ghosting? Why lead her to this? She didn't have the answer, but she knew the lie was no longer quiet. It had a pulse now, a voice, and it lived not just in the documents or photographs, but in the way her own memory of him began to unravel. She found herself questioning every moment. Had his laugh ever been real? His love for Jake, the anniversary dinners, the hand-sent poems, the silent car ride. She stared at the final photo, Grant, or Marcus, holding Nora on his shoulders, the girl's arms raised in triumph, and realized with a cold, hollow certainty that he hadn't just left her. He had rebuilt himself into someone who looked happy to be forgotten. The floor creaked somewhere in the house, the echo pulling her back to the present. She stood, slowly repacked the box, and carried it into the guest room, locking it inside the dresser drawer that stuck slightly when pulled too hard. She would deal with what came next tomorrow. For now, her world had tilted, and she needed solid ground before facing the truth waiting just beyond the next corner. The following afternoon, Lena returned to the drawer where she had locked away the steel box and USB. Sleep had eluded her again the night before, the weight of discovery coiling tight around her spine, refusing to loosen its grip. She hadn't eaten, hadn't spoken to anyone. Her phone sat face down on the kitchen counter, ignored. As she opened the drawer and retrieved the box, her hands no longer trembled. It wasn't calm exactly, but something colder, resolve maybe, or numbness finally shaped into function. She carried the box to the dining table and opened it once more, this time methodically, like a forensic analyst rather than a grieving widow. The stack of photographs was thicker than she remembered. She began from the top, sorting them into groups: Grant alone, Grant with the woman, Grant with the child. The girl appeared in more photos than any other. In one, she wore a birthday hat and held a cupcake, a large glittery tin balloon floating in the background. The photo had a timestamp printed in the bottom corner, October 2021. Lena's heart knocked hard against her chest. 10. The girl was 10 3 years ago. That meant she had been born in 2011, just 1 year after Grant vanished. Lena pressed the photo flat on the table, staring at every detail. The icing on the cupcake, the paper banner reading Nora's birthday bash, the way Grant's arm rested protectively around the girl's shoulders. There was nothing in his expression that suggested secrecy or shame. He looked proud, present, like a father. And not just a father, an established one. He hadn't simply stumbled into this new life, he had begun it swiftly, calculatedly. The math was simple, brutal. If Nora had been born in the fall of 2011, then the woman, Valerie Shaw, must have been pregnant within months of Grant's disappearances. Lena sat back in her chair, breath shallow. This wasn't infidelity hidden inside their marriage. This was something else entirely. A clean break, an intentional restart, timed with precision. He hadn't been lost. He had already been building something new. She turned to the laptop, the USB still plugged in. A folder named Correspondence caught her attention. She hadn't opened it yet. Inside were a dozen emails saved as PDFs, most dated between 2011 and 2020. One in particular stood out, a long message sent from Grant's alias email, marcus.linley@trailsideprint.com, to a recipient named leon.fraser99@gmail.com. She opened it. The email was written in Grant's typical verbose style, laced with literary metaphors and run-on sentences. It began with a casual update. Leon, the Boise shop finally turned a profit this quarter. I never thought I'd enjoy repairing HP printers, but there's a rhythm to it I can't ignore. Like rebuilding old prose, tedious but satisfying. Lena's stomach turned. He described life in Idaho as quiet, manageable, said he liked the routine and mentioned plans to expand to a second location in Spokane. He referenced Nora briefly, noting how she's taken to drawing now, says she wants to write books one day. Near the end of the message he wrote, "Sometimes I dream about the past, not with regret, but with a sense of distance, like reading someone else's journal, but I give her half-truths. She deserves peace, and so do I." Lena leaned back from the screen, stunned by the casual cruelty of his words. Half-truths, distance. He had likened their entire life together, her grief, Jake's loss, 2 decades of unanswered questions, to an old journal best left unread. He hadn't left out of desperation, he had left because it was cleaner, easier. Lena closed the laptop slowly, her hand covering her mouth. The name of his shop, Trailside Print, had come up twice. A quick search online revealed its original location in Idaho Falls, listed under a local business registry. The listing included a blurry image of the storefront, a plain brick building with a blue awning, and the name in white letters. No sign of Grant, Marcus, she reminded herself, but it was confirmation he hadn't even bothered to hide deeply. He had just counted on her not to look. The realization hollowed her out in a way that the original disappearance never had. When Grant vanished, Lena had constructed 1,000 stories to fill the void. Maybe he'd had a breakdown. Maybe he was in a hospital suffering from memory loss. Maybe he had run from debt, from shame, from something so dark he couldn't speak it. But this was willful. It was strategy. He had chosen to erase them. Lena rose from her seat and walked to the hallway mirror, the one with the slight crack in the corner. She stared at her reflection, searching for traces of the woman she had once been. The crow's feet were deeper, the eyes a little duller, but what struck her most was the expression she didn't recognize. Not sadness, not anger, but something steelier. She looked like someone sharpening a knife, not for revenge, but for clarity. She returned to the table, pulled the birthday photo back in front of her, and studied it again. In the background, faint but visible, hung a child's hand-drawn sign taped to the wall. Happy birthday to the dad ever. Her throat tightened. She imagined Jake at that age, the way he'd drawn fire trucks and dinosaurs and signed them to Dad. How had Grant compartmentalized it all? How had he built new love atop the grave of the old one without flinching? Or had he flinched and simply decided to look away? Lena reached for her phone for the first time in hours. She opened the photo app and scrolled back, years, then more years. She found a picture of Grant holding Jake on his shoulders at the Oregon coast, 1999. Grant looked nearly the same as in the recent photos, save for the grayer beard and lined forehead. The smile, the posture, it was practiced, consistent. She no longer knew which version of him had been real, or whether all of them were. Her hands moved on their own, grabbing a yellow legal pad from the drawer. She began to write, not a letter, not a journal entry, but a list. Dates, locations, names. She needed a timeline. She needed truth, even if it came in fragments. The past was no longer a memory. It was an investigation, and she was no longer mourning a husband. She was tracking a man who had become a stranger. Lena didn't waste time. The morning after compiling her list of names and dates, she sat at her desk at Dog-Eared & Co., staring at the business card she'd pulled from the community corkboard by the post office the week prior. It was matte black, with clean serif lettering, Ivana Gilroy, private investigator. Below it, a simple phone number. She dialed. The voice that answered was calm, professional, almost bored. "Well," Lena paused, breath catching slightly. "Hi, this is Lena Harris. I need to find someone. His legal name is Grant Harris, but he may be going by Marcus Lindley now. I have documents I'd like to meet." Eva didn't ask questions. She just said, "My office," 10 minutes early, clutching a manila folder packed with every detail she'd uncovered. Eva's office sat above a consignment shop, the stairs creaking beneath Lena's step. Inside, it smelled faintly of old carpet and burnt coffee. Eva stood as Lena entered, offering a hand and a nod. She was in her mid-40s, with short hair and a demeanor that suggested she had seen just about everything. Lena laid out the photos, the PDFs from the USB, the printouts from Trailside Prints business registration. "He vanished in 2004, she said, voice steady but taut. "Everyone thought he was dead. We even held a memorial. But he didn't die. He started over, and I need to know where he is now, who he really is, what he's done." Eva leaped through the contents without speaking, her eyes sharp, moving faster than seemed possible. She pulled a legal pad from her drawer and jotted a few notes. "You say he's going by Marcus Lindley?" Lena nodded. Eva tapped one of the flight receipts. "Lawrence, Kansas, then Boise, then Spokane. If he's kept the pattern, he's headed north." She glanced up. "Give me 10 days. I'll find him." Lena thanked her quietly, unsure of how to sit with the strange relief that followed. For 20 years, she'd lived with the agony of not knowing. Now she was finally chasing truth, and she had help. The weight stretched like taut thread. Lena went through the motions at work, stocked shelves, rang up customers, smiled on autopilot. Jake called on Wednesday, and she didn't mention anything. She couldn't, not yet. She was careful not to leave the laptop open at home, careful to lock the steel box every night. Each morning she checked her phone before coffee, hoping for a text or voicemail from Eva. None came, not until day 10. The message was brief. "Call me, I have a name, address, confirmation." Lena's fingers shook as she hit redial. Eva picked up on the first ring. "He's living in Missoula, Montana, owns a home under the name Marcus E. Lindley. No red flags in utilities or DMV records, but here's where it gets interesting. He's never filed a divorce from you. Legally, you're still his wife. The woman he lives with now, Valerie Shaw, is not listed on any marriage certificate. No joint property, no shared mortgage, just overlapping tax addresses and cohabitation. And she's not aware. I ran a soft contact sweep. No record of her requesting a name change. No alias history. She thinks she's living with a man named Marcus Lindley, a single father, originally from Colorado." Lena stood frozen in her kitchen, the words crashing over her like icy waves. Not only had he started over, he had done so illegally, carelessly, assuming no one would dig deep enough to reveal the layers beneath. She was still his wife on paper. 20 years later, she still bore his name in legal terms, if not in heart. And the woman he shared a life with had no idea she was sharing it with a fraud. Eva continued, "I also pulled DMV photos. It's him, older, but no doubt. He looks settled. The house is modest, two-storm colonial on Evergreen Avenue. There's a school bus stop 2 doors down. They have a Labrador, same as the one in your photo." Lena sat slowly, hand covering her mouth. The room swayed gently. Eva's voice softened, just slightly. "Do you want me to dig further? Travel out there, or do you want to handle it? Lena didn't answer right away. Her mind raced, not with revenge, not yet, but with logistics. With the truth? No, she said at last. I want to do this myself, but I need everything you have, documents, screenshots, property records. I want it in writing. Eva agreed to send a full report by the next day, encrypted, password protected. Lena thanked her again, hung up, and stared at the phone in her hand as if it had betrayed her. She felt hollowed out but filled with heat at the same time, betrayal mixing with clarity, like acid and ice. She was still married to him. That fact rippled through her like a legal curse she hadn't realized still lived in the corners of her life. She spent that evening reviewing every document Eva sent. The property deed had Grant's alias listed alone, purchased in 2016. He had a Montana driver's license. His voter registration was clean, no red flags. A LinkedIn profile under Marcus Lindley listed him as owner and operator Trailside Repair Solutions. It even included a tagline, helping your machines run as smoothly as your days should. Lena nearly laughed. The bland professionalism of it all felt like a slap. She imagined Valerie seeing that page, imagining her partner as a quiet man who repaired things for a living, who came home with ink stains on his hands and a smile for their daughter. What would she do when she found out? Would she accuse Lena of lying, or would she turn to Grant or Marcus and see the truth etched into the lines around his eyes, the fear beneath his calm? Better to know, but she knew this. He didn't get to decide the narrative anymore. Not after years of silence, not after letting her grieve a man who was still breathing, not after walking away from Jake without a backward glance. She printed the key documents and stored them in a locked drawer at the back of the shop, just in case. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She pulled her wedding certificate from the old file box under her bed. Her name, his name, the date, the seal of Oregon embossed like a scar. As she held the paper in her hands, her mind sharpened. This wasn't about holding on. It was about letting go the right way. Not in shadow, not with ambiguity, but with evidence, with full acknowledgement of what had been done. She placed the certificate next to Eva's file, then reached for a new manila folder and labeled it Harris, Legal E. Her fingers didn't shake this time. She was preparing not for confrontation, but for truth. And truth, finally, was hers to carry forward. Lena waited 3 more days before she mailed the letter. It wasn't hesitation born of doubt, but of precision. She wanted the timing to be deliberate, the message sharp, irrefutable, impossible to misinterpret. She typed it on her old Smith Corona typewriter, the kind Grant used to admire, with its heavy keys and slight misalignments. 1 sentence, decide-ified, no signature, no return address. I found the box. Don't write to Jake. She printed it on plain white paper, folded it once, and sealed it inside a standard envelope. She addressed it by hand to Marcus Lindley at the Missoula address Eva had confirmed, using her least identifiable script. At the post office, she chose regular postage. No tracking, no express, just something quietly certain. She dropped it into the blue mailbox on the corner of Main and Laurel, the same one she'd used for decades, and walked away without turning back. That night, she slept longer than she had in weeks, dreamless and still. The days that followed settled into a strange, electric calm. She went about her routine with a kind of heightened awareness, like a musician waiting for the downbeat. At Dog-Eared & Co., she reordered stock, restocked the local author shelf, added a new section for stories of reinvention. She didn't tell anyone what she'd done. Not Jake, not her neighbor Judy, not even Ruth at the library, who had become something of a quiet confidant. Lena simply waited. 21 days later, just as the late November sky began to darken around 5 p.m., he arrived. The bell over the door jingled softly, its sound oddly muted in the quiet of closing time. Lena was wiping the counter, her hands moving on instinct, her back turned when she heard the footsteps. She looked up, and there he was, Grant, or Marcus, or whatever version of himself he now believed in. He looked older, of course, thinner. The beard was fully gray, trimmed too neatly. His glasses were newer, square-framed. He wore a navy jacket she didn't recognize, and boots too clean for Montana mud. But the eyes, they were the same, worn, sharp, quietly calculating. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, holding his hands loosely at his sides, like a man preparing to apologize but unsure of the words. Lena didn't offer him a seat. She didn't ask how he'd found her. She simply said, "You got the letter?" He nodded. "You didn't sign it." Her expression didn't change. "I didn't mean to hurt you." She tilted her head slightly. "Then why did you—" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she remembered. "It wasn't about you, it was about me. I felt trapped, ordinary, like I was slowly vanishing inside my own life." Lena didn't flinch. "So you made sure you disappeared completely?" He stepped forward a little, not quite into the light. "I thought it would be cleaner, easier for everyone if I just left." No fights, no blame, just absence. Her voice was ice. "You thought pretending to die would be easier?" He didn't look at her then. "I didn't plan it exactly. At first I just needed space. Then it turned into something else. And then Valerie got pregnant, and it all made sense to stay gone." Lena's jaw tightened, her pulse steady. "And Jake," she asked, "did it make sense to let your son think you were dead?" Grant looked down. "I thought it would be worse if he knew the truth." She let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "You think this version is better?" He looked at her then, really looked. Her voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. "I do understand. You left. You lied. You built a new life. I grieved you. I buried you. And now I know the truth. That's all I needed." He stepped closer, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't confuse my silence for permission," she said. "Don't mistake this bookstore, this moment, for reconciliation." He looked almost wounded, but Lena didn't blink. "I'm not angry anymore," she continued. "Anger would imply I still care. I came through that storm already. Alone. You don't get to walk back in and act like we're two people who just drifted apart." He nodded slowly, swallowing. "I won't contact Jake again, I promise." Lena studied him carefully. "You already did. The moment you walked away. You've haunted him ever since." He opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to deflect, but she cut him off. "Don't explain. You said enough when you left without a word." For a moment there was only the sound of the clock ticking near the back wall, the hum of the heater, the faint rattle of wind against the window pane. Finally he turned to go. At the door he paused. "I'm sorry, Lena," he said, "even if it doesn't mean anything to you now." She didn't answer. She just watched him leave. The bell jingled again, this time sharper. She stood alone in the shop, the air colder than before. She turned the sign to close, locked the door, and stood there a moment longer. The street outside was empty, the sky darkening fast, and somewhere in the distance the sound of a train whistle split the silence like a line drawn clean between past and present. 3 days after Grant appeared at the bookstore, he returned. Lena had locked the door early that evening, not expecting or wanting company, but when she saw his silhouette pause outside the glass, she didn't turn him away. Instead, she opened the door wordlessly, let him in, and motioned toward the small reading nook near the window. He followed without protest. The overhead lights were dim, casting soft shadows across the worn floorboards. Lena sat first, back straight, fingers laced over her knee. Grant settled into the opposite chair like a man uninvited to his own reckoning. For a long while, neither spoke. The silence pressed thick between them until Lena said, "If you came back, it means there's more you need to say, so say it." Grant shifted, looked at his hands, then met her eyes. "It wasn't just feeling trapped. That wasn't the whole reason I left." Lena's expression didn't change, but inside her chest something shifted, braced. "There was a student," he continued. "Her name was Valerie. She was 22. Graduated the year before. She came to my office one afternoon to ask about publishing options. We talked. Then we talked more. I told myself it was harmless. But it wasn't." He paused, watching Lena carefully, waiting for her to react, but she gave him nothing. "We had an affair," he said. "I was terrified someone would find out. I'd already lost tenure. If the school discovered the relationship, I could lose my license entirely, what little reputation I had left. She didn't pressure me. She didn't even expect anything serious. But when she got pregnant, I panicked." Lena finally spoke, her voice level. "So you disappeared?" Grant nodded slowly. I convinced myself that walking away would protect everyone. You, Jake, even Valerie. I thought if I started fresh, new name, new city, I could manage the fallout before it exploded. I told myself I was doing the merciful thing. Lena's lips curled into something that wasn't a smile. And you think leaving a teenage boy to believe his father drowned was merciful? Grant flinched, but said nothing. I read everything, she said. I saw the birthday photos, the emails, the fake IDs. You lived a full life while we waited for a body. He leaned forward, voice low. I didn't stop watching. I know that sounds like nothing, but I need you to hear it. I followed your life online, quietly. Jake's graduation photos, the scholarship article in the local paper. I knew when he got into the University of Montana. I read about the library award you won in 2017. I saw when you repainted the bookstore, when you added that nonfiction corner. I never stopped caring. Lena blinked, slowly letting the weight of his words fall around her. You cared from a distance, she said, like someone watching a play they wrote and walked out on halfway through. Grant looked exhausted. I didn't know how to come back. Every year that passed, it got harder to imagine what I'd say. Then Nora was born, and everything became about her. Valerie believed I was someone else. She didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers. I tried to become the man I pretended to be. Lena stared at him, her voice quieter now. And did you succeed? Grant hesitated. In some ways, yes. I was present, stable, but part of me was always here. I thought about you more than I should have. Lena tilted her head, but not enough to send a postcard, not enough to call, not enough to let him know he wasn't abandoned. Grant's shoulders slumped. I didn't believe I deserved forgiveness, so I never asked for it. She stood then, slowly, the chair creaking beneath her. You don't get to decide when you reappear. You gave up the right to forgiveness the moment you chose silence over truth. But you don't get to hide anymore either. I'm done protecting the ghost of you. Grant looked up, face pale beneath the overhead glow. What are you going to do? Lena didn't answer right away. She walked to the counter, turned off the register light, and returned with a small, worn folder. What you should have done years ago, she said. I'm making things legal. You're still my husband on paper. That ends now. She handed him a copy of the petition, annulling declaration of abandonment, legal separation, with cause. You don't need to agree. The evidence is enough. Grant didn't reach for it. He only stared at the front page, his name typed beside hers like a faded echo. Does Jake know? He asked. Lena's face hardened. No, and unless he asks, I won't burden him with this version of you. That's my choice. My boundary. You've stolen enough of his peace. Grant exhaled slowly, not with love, not even with rage, but with a clarity she hadn't known she'd needed. Do you? She asked. Do you understand what it means to be forgotten by someone you never stopped remembering? He didn't answer. He just sat there, older than she remembered, smaller than he'd ever seemed. The bookstore felt quieter than usual, the air tight, waiting. Lena picked up the folder again, tapped it once against her palm, and walked toward the door. I'm going to mail these tomorrow. You'll get your copies in Missoula. Don't come back here again, Grant. This chapter is closed. She opened the door, letting the cold. Grant stood, nodded once, and stepped into the darkness. Lena shut the door behind him, locked it, and leaned against the frame. Her reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar for a moment. Tired, yes, but 2 mornings after Grant left the bookstore for the last time, Lena sat across from her attorney in a sunlit office lined with beige file cabinets and the steady hum of a wall-mount heater. Judith Owens, a precise woman with Arctic blonde hair and tortoise-shell glasses, tapped the edges of a document together and said, "You're sure about this?" Lena nodded once, her voice even. "Absolutely. I want it filed by end of week." The paperwork on the table was thick. 3 stapled petitions, 1 declaration of marital abandonment under Oregon state law, and an irrevocable waiver of inheritance and all shared marital assets. Lena had insisted it be clear. She wasn't seeking restitution. She didn't want Grant's money, past or future. She wanted a statement on record that she was severing every legal tie to him, especially the ones he had abused. Judith reviewed the language again before sliding it into a courier envelope. "You're not obligated to notify him directly," she said. "He'll be served through certified mail, legally sufficient." Lena didn't blink. "I'll be sending something else, separately." That afternoon, Lena returned home, opened her desktop computer, and compiled a digital package of everything Eva had found. The fake IDs, the false tax filings under Marcus Lindley, the business registrations across multiple states, and a timeline of his disappearances and reinvention. She added her own scanned copy of their original marriage certificate, the legal declaration she had just filed, and a brief cover letter. Then she uploaded it all to a secure server and submitted it to the IRS whistleblower program. The same folder she printed twice, one for the State Department of Revenue and another for the National Fraud Division, mailed with tracking confirmation and a return receipt request. It wasn't revenge, it was exposure. Lena knew that by legal standards she had no criminal case to pursue personally, but the evidence she held in her hands had implications: misfiled taxes, false identities, undeclared income. She had no interest in seeing him behind bars, but she would not allow him to continue living untouched. A week later, Judith's office sent out a formal notice to Grant's current partner, Valerie Shaw, enclosing a letter written with measured detachment. It read, "As you may not be aware, the man you know as Marcus E. Lindley was previously known under another legal identity, Grant D. Harris, whom he never legally divorced. Per enclosed court records and state declarations, he remains legally married to Lena Harris. You may also find attached a certified copy of the birth certificate for Nora Shaw, listing the father as unknown. Additionally, enclosed are recent photographs and notarized affidavits attesting to Mr. Lindley's use of fraudulent identities across multiple jurisdictions." Lena had insisted the tone be clear, not vindictive. She didn't want Valerie to suffer out of spite. She wanted her to know the man she had trusted had built his entire presence on a ratio. 3 days after the letter was delivered, Eva called Lena from a withheld number. Her voice was calm but certain. She left, packed 2 bags, took the kid, and drove off. A neighbor said it happened the same night she got a manila envelope in the mail. No screaming, no scene, just headlights and silent matter, and relief that lie had fractured, the silence was broken. She imagined Valerie's face reading the name Grant Harris for the first time, tracing it backward through memory, like smoke returning to fire. Imagined her fingers trembling over birth records, wondering what else had been false. Later that evening, Lena received a voicemail from an unfamiliar number. It was brief. A woman's voice, soft but clipped. "This is Valerie. I got your letter. I believe you. I don't know what happens next, but thank you for the truth." Lena replayed it twice, then deleted it. It wasn't hers to keep. She poured herself a cup of tea and stared out the kitchen window. The rosemary plant by the sill was wilting, too much cold, not enough sun, but its scent still lingered in the air. The house felt different now. Not emptier, but clearer. For the first time in years, it wasn't haunted by uncertainty. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was acting. 2 days later, Lena walked into her bank and updated her will, removed Grant's name from any associated paperwork, and revoked power of attorney. She filed a notice of change for her emergency contact, choosing Jake's name instead, even though she wasn't ready to tell him the full truth. She kept the file sealed for now, marked "Open only if necessary," tucked into a secure drawer behind the front desk at the bookstore. Customers continued to come and go. She smiled when she meant it, nodded when she didn't. A few noticed she seemed lighter, like something long folded had been pressed open. Ruth from the library brought her a new mystery novel and a jar of apple jam. Judy across the street asked if she wanted to come by for supper. No pressure. Lena said yes. The documents she'd sent out had begun to ripple. She received a letter from the Montana Department of Business Regulation acknowledging her fraud report. Another from the IRS, dry but efficient, confirming they were reviewing the materials submitted. Lena didn't need updates. She didn't need closure from the government. What she needed was already happening. Consequences, truth filling the vacuum where silence had once ruled. She checked the store mailbox each morning with a quiet kind of anticipation, not for apologies, but for proof that the world was finally catching up to a truth she had long carried alone. That night, as she swept the shop floors, she paused at the window, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. Winter was coming. The cold would settle in, the nights would stretch. But inside, Lena no longer moved through shadows. She had broken the seal. She had told the truth, not just to herself, but to the world. And in doing so, something long buried inside her had begun to breathe again. In early March, as the last patches of snow melted off the sidewalks and the first tulip shoots emerged behind the bookstore, Lena received an envelope marked "Confidential" from the Department of Justice. She opened it slowly, half expecting something more procedural than personal, but the first page confirmed what she had suspected all along. An internal audit had concluded that Grant Harris, operating under the alias Marcus Lynn Lee, had engaged in fraudulent tax filings, identity misrepresentation, and financial misreporting across 3 states for nearly 2 decades. The details were exhaustive: false Social Security data linked to inactive identifiers, business earnings undeclared for several years, and a network of banking under a name he had no legal right to use. The statute of limitations for criminal prosecution had expired in most jurisdictions, and the federal office had opted not to pursue a case in court due to the complexity and age of the violations. But the consequences were still concrete. All of Grant's existing accounts had been frozen, pending investigation, his personal and business finances flagged for asset recovery, and liens placed on any properties tied to the Marcus Lindley identity. He wouldn't go to jail, but he would lose everything he had built from the bones of his lies. Lena read the findings twice, then filed them in the same drawer where she kept her finalized legal separation. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel anything close to vengeance, only a soft sense of distance, like hearing about an earthquake in a town you once visited, real enough to shake you, but far enough not to break your windows. 2 weeks later, she received another envelope, this one smaller, handwritten, addressed only with her name. Inside was a single note from Grant. No preamble, no apology, just 4 lines. "I lost everything. Nora asks about me daily. Valerie won't speak to me. I deserve this. But I would still like to see you. One time, please." Lena folded the note from Grant, played it slowly and again. The flames took it slowly, curling the corners, then rising quick as breath. That night, as she closed the shop, her phone buzzed. Unknown number, she let it ring to voicemail. 30 seconds later, the message arrived. Grant's voice, hollow and thinner than she remembered. "Lena, I know what I did can't be undone. I know I burned the bridge and salted the ground. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just a goodbye." Face to face. She stared at the phone for a long time before deleting the message. The next day, she instructed Judith to send a final letter to Grant's legal representative. It was brief, notarized, final. M.L. Lena Harris declines any further communication in person or otherwise. She waives all claims to past financial restitution and requests no legal or personal contact be attempted from Mr. Harris. This decision is irrevocable and requires no response. With it, Lena included a handwritten line, her only personal contribution. "You disappeared from us, now I disappear from you." The spring came in quietly. The sky lingered blue longer each evening. Customers returned with lighter jackets and dog-eared reading lists. Jake called more often now, twice a week, and though Lena still hadn't told him everything, she no longer felt the pressure of hiding it. One day she would tell him the whole story, but not as a wound, as a reckoning that had already passed. He was thriving, happy in his job at the museum, dating someone who sounded kind, calling to ask about pot reese recipes and poetry recommendations. He didn't ask about his father, and Lena didn't offer. She knew the silence between them on that topic was no longer a wall. It was a choice, a shared, unspoken agreement that the future mattered more than the fracture behind them. In May, Lena closed the store for one day and drove out to the coast alone, the same beach where she and Grant had once taken Jake to chase kites. The shoreline was quieter than she remembered, wind softer, sea foam pale and glittering under the sun. She walked barefoot to the edge of the tide, stood with the woman who had left, but about the woman who had remained. She had survived grief, survived betrayal. She had stared into the hollow place where love had once lived and found something else instead. Resolve. Not bitterness, not denial, but a kind of peace with truth, not illusion. On the drive home, she played an old cassette she hadn't touched in years. Nina Simone, her voice raw and powerful, filled the car. The hills raw past, green and alive. Linda didn't cry. She didn't feel the need to. She had already done the mourning, already buried the story she once clung to. Now, there was only this. A woman who had lost everything and chosen, quietly and without permission, to keep living anyway. She arrived back at the bookstore just before dusk. The wind chimes above the door tinkled faintly as she unlocked the door. She stepped inside, turned on the lamp in the corner, and poured herself a cup of tea. Outside, the world moved on, unaware of the war she had waged and won without raising her voice. Inside, the shelves stood tall, the air smelled faintly of paper and lavender, and Lena Harris, no longer anyone's wife, no longer anyone's secret, sat down to read beneath the soft, golden light of her own making. If this story moved you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next mystery waiting to be uncovered. Hit like if you felt something shift while reading. What part of Lena's journey struck you the most? And where are you watching from? Drop a comment. I'd love to know who's out there listening to stories that refuse to stay buried.